Israeli politicians and pundits have been discussing moving Palestinians in Gaza to other countries, including regions like South America and the African continent. Knesset member and former UN ambassador Danny Danon said Israel had received inquiries from countries willing to take in refugees from the Gaza Strip. In an interview on the Israeli radio station Kan Bet, Danon said he's been in contact with a number of countries in the past on this issue, such as South American countries and African ones. He added that some of them asked for payment in return and other forms of contributions. This is not new. There's quite a history of Israeli politicians discussing projects of massive transfers of Palestinians. According to the Jerusalem Post, Israel secretly encouraged or planned to encourage the emigration of 60,000 Palestinians to Latin America. That was back in 1969. Declassified documents of an Israeli meeting held 51 years ago revealed plans of a massive transfer of Palestinians to Paraguay as part of an agreement between the two countries. The plans included Israeli funding for flights transferring Palestinians who agreed to leave Gaza, a $100 grant for each of them, and $33 per person to the Paraguayan government. And since 2014, Israeli experts and politicians have discussed at length plans to relocate Gazans to the Sinai Peninsula in Egypt. Well, Antony Loewenstein is an independent journalist and author of The Palestine Laboratory. He joins me now live from Sydney. Good to have you with us, Antony. So let's start, first of all, with the latest comments. How seriously should we take comments from people like Danny Danon about transferring Gazans outside of their native Gaza?
Well, very seriously, as you said, Sammy, in your introduction, the fact is that there's been Israeli plans to remove huge amounts of Palestinians pretty much from the beginning. People know a lot about 1948, the Nakba, 1967. There's actually been huge amounts of other examples. And in some ways, what Israel has, inverted commas, is a problem, that they have too many Palestinians in their view. And over the decades, there's been huge amounts of plans to remove anybody who's either not Jewish or, for example, black Africans, and we can talk about that later. But ultimately, Israel takes this very seriously. And in fact, just the last few days, the Israeli foreign minister came out on Israeli television, essentially said to countries, email me, call me, literally, and we're willing to discuss ways for you to take huge amounts of Palestinians. So this is a serious issue that the world should take very serious notice of.
Antony, bear with us for a second. We want to listen in to this statement on Israeli TV. It's actually of the Foreign Minister, Eli Cohen, calling on officials from other countries to reach out if they want to take in Palestinian refugees.
הנה, אנחנו כאן נמצאים בשידור, משרד החוץ, יש לנו גם מייל, יש לנו גם טלפון עם כל 21 המדינות בליגה הערבית, או כל אותן מדינות אחרות שאגב, קלטו פליטים סורים, קלטו פליטים אוקראינים, קלטו מקרים בקונפליקטים אחרים. אם מישהו רוצה לקלוט, עשינו מספר פניות על ידי גורמים אצלנו, מוזמן בבקשה להתקשר, לשלוח מייל, תשאירו רק את הכתובת של המדינה ואנחנו נפנה.
So, Antony, I'm not sure if you caught the gist of that, but it's basically, hey, if you're interested in taking Palestinians, drop me an email. What kind of dehumanization does that create when you talk about people, not just any people, people in their native land as some kind of, I don't know, merch on eBay that you can just email if you want me to ship them off to you?
You know, one of the most underreported issues of what's happening in Israel-Palestine, both since October 7, but certainly before, is actually that Israeli society, Jewish society, has been radicalised. And what I mean by that is that public opinion polls long before October 7, and certainly since, have shown actually the majority of Israeli Jews support the removal of Palestinians from Gaza. Now, this was happening before October 7, and in fact, there was a poll just this week that found that around 70 to 80% of Israeli Jews support the idea of finding somewhere else for Palestinians who are native, as you say, to Gaza to be removed. Now, Israel claims this is somehow voluntary, which is nonsense. I mean, Gaza is being made uninhabitable deliberately, and therefore there are many other countries that potentially are being forced or strong-armed or offered other deals, such as weapons, as I document in my book, to take Palestinians. And the question is, which countries will actually take those people, if any?
Antony, this is not theory, is it? Take us through the history of plans being discussed and reports that they were to some degree actually implemented to transfer Palestinians to Latin America.
Look, as soon as you touched on this in your beginning, as soon as the 1967 war happened, there was a convening of the Israeli cabinet, and there was a serious discussion at the highest levels to find ways to remove what they regarded as excess Arabs that would dilute, in their view, the Jewish population. As you said, Paraguay was examined, and Paraguay, to be clear, at the time was a dictatorship, which after World War II had taken in some Nazi war criminals, including Joseph Mengele, who was the notorious angel of death doctor at Auschwitz. This was no impediment to Israel potentially working with them. That plan didn't really happen, and only a handful of Palestinians actually left. And over the decades since then, there's been a number of other attempts to take in or force or convince other nations that were seen as pro-Israel, Brazil amongst others. It's never really worked, is the long and the short of it. That virtually no Palestinians have wanted to leave, and virtually no other nations have been able to be bribed enough. But the plans have always been there, and that's been accelerated since October 7.
And there is something of a history of transferring people to Africa, right, from Israel. Talk us through that and the statements that have been reported in the media, quoting Israeli officials, referring to African migrants, asylum seekers, as a threat to Israel's Jewish character or as a cancer.
In the last 20 years or so, there was a lot of African migrants who came to Israel, tens of thousands, in fact, because they were fleeing persecution and war in their continent. And this was never particularly popular within Israel because they were not Jewish, of course, and they were seen as infiltrators. As you said, some politicians called them cancers. There were huge amounts of protests around Tel Aviv and elsewhere against these Africans. I did a lot of reporting about this over the years, actually, including I was based in South Sudan in 2015. And bizarrely enough, Israel in the last decade was bribing and promoting the concept to Rwanda and Uganda, giving them money, giving them weapons to take huge amounts of Africans. Africans are then dumped from Israel in those countries and then left to fend for themselves. Many ended up in South Sudan, where I met some of them in the capital, Juba. And these people are destitute. They have nowhere to go. They're legitimate refugees. And this, I think, fits into a long pattern where these people, of course, are not Palestinian, but they're not Jewish. This is the key point, that it was seen to dilute the so-called Jewish character of the country. And this was led by Netanyahu, amongst others. And to the point now where over the last decade or so, barely any Africans have been granted refugee status in Israel, and there are some still there, but very, very few. Israel has essentially fortified and ghettoized itself, where it's virtually impossible for Africans fleeing dictatorships in their own continent to come to Israel. So this has a long history, including a recent one, where Rwanda and Uganda, who are now quite close allies of Israel, are essentially bribed and given weapons to take in so-called unwanted people from Israel.
Antony, briefly, what has that got to do? Take us through the history of what the transfer of people has got to do with the arms trade.
Look, the arms trade has been central to Israel's existence from the beginning. I document this in the book a lot, and this accelerated after 1967. The short answer is that virtually the vast majority of countries on the planet, dictatorships and democracies, have wanted various forms of Israeli weapons or surveillance equipment or repressive tech in the modern era. And this has played in very clearly to nations right now as we speak that I'm sure are interested in potentially taking some kinds of numbers of Palestinians from Gaza. Now, we don't know exactly which nations are being talked to. I could only presume it's going to be Israeli-friendly countries in Africa, potentially the new leader in Argentina, who's madly pro-Israel, a far-right fundamentalist dictator who's just taken over there. And it's pretty clear that nations like that will want money, but also weapons, because Israel's key export asset for years is exporting the weapons of dictatorship and occupation from Palestine to those nations. So the occupation, therefore, is exported. It's a key part of Israel's raison d'etre, and that's going to continue, I suspect, in years to come. So this serious threat, it's a serious threat that Israel is looking for nations. Now, they won't take 2.3 million Palestinians, but they might take 100,000, 10,000 here, 10,000 there. And that's not just the Sinai, which obviously is Israel's great dream, to the point finally, Netanyahu just this week spoke to a Likud meeting in Israel where he said openly, it's not a secret, our plan is to expel Palestinians. This is the plan. And yet so far, there's been no serious response from the US or any country. This has long been the plan. And finally, we're at a point where Gaza is being made deliberately uninhabitable, that many other nations may be bribed or strong-armed to take these people.
Antony, stay with us for a second, because you mentioned the statement by Netanyahu, and it's not just politicians. Let's take a look at this opinion piece in the Jerusalem Post. I think we can pull it up now, where it explores why moving to the Sinai Peninsula is what they call solution for Gaza's Palestinians. And the piece claims that the Sinai Peninsula comprises one of the most, what it calls, suitable places on earth to provide the people of Gaza with hope and a peaceful future. When you read statements like the one you mentioned of Netanyahu or pieces like that, you've got to remind yourself that we're ultimately talking about what international human rights groups like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, what UN experts said on October the 13th, they've called this basically forced displacement a war crime, right? That's how it stands in international law.
That's exactly what it is. And that PC reference is one of many. And that, I think, goes to the heart of what I was saying before, that there has been over the last decades, well before October 7, a radicalisation within Israeli Jewish society. And I speak as someone Jewish myself, although not living in Israel, of course, I live outside. But it's something that really has struck me for a long time, that there are seemingly very few red lines amongst the global Jewish diaspora community. Of course, there are Jews who oppose what's happening, myself included. That goes without saying. But in terms of the mainstream Jewish diaspora organisations who are seeing what is being proposed in the US, in the UK and elsewhere, they are not opposing it.
Right.
They're not saying this is outrageous, that you cannot remove people forcibly or so-called voluntarily from Gaza. It's an absolute red line that cannot be crossed.
Right. All right. Antony Loewenstein, good to get your thoughts. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Sammy.